Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for viewing this very special first edition of the Meet the Professor series. The Meet the Professor series highlights the great research and expertise of various professors across the Elizabethtown College campus in a special pre-recorded segment just for alumni. A professor will be featured once a month throughout the fall, so don't forget to check back here for all the newest series segments. On this edition, we welcome Dr. Jeffery Long, Professor of Religion and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College. He will be leading us through an introduction into his recently published work, Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds. Dr. Long, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And so I wanted to kind of share this little anecdote, but when we first contacted Dr. Long, he had mentioned that after 20 years of working at the college, he has probably taught more than 2,000 students that are now alumni, and we are so lucky to feature him today. I also wanted to mention that while this is a pre-recorded segment, you can always continue the conversation with Dr. Long by emailing him at longjd@etown.edu. And with that, I would like to share a short biography. Dr. Jeffery Long is Professor of Religion and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College, where he has taught since receiving his doctoral degree from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. He is the author of A Vision for Hinduism, Jainism, an Introduction, the Historical Dictionary of Hinduism, first and second editions, and most recently, Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds. He is also the editor of Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific, and co-author of the Buddhism, Jainism volumes of the Springer Encyclopedia of Indian Religions. In 2018, Dr. Long received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Seva Award for his work to promote accurate and sensitive portrayals of Hindu traditions in the American education system and media. He has presented in venues around the world, including 3 presentations in 2019 at the United Nations in New York. Finally, Dr. Long is also an avid fan and inspiring author of science fiction. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Long, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin your video so you can kind of take it from there.
Okay. Thank you so much. And namaste, everyone. Good morning, or whatever time you're viewing this. Good day or good evening. And thank you so much for tuning in. I want to share just a little bit with you about my new book. Here it is, Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, published by Bloomsbury Press. Since alumni are watching this, you might be interested in knowing I've created a new course based on this topic, Hinduism in America. It's going to be offered for the first time next semester. It's going to be on the schedule. And so a little bit about the background about the book, and then I have a presentation that I want to share with you. So I was invited to write this book about 5 years ago. So it's taken me that long to put it all together. However, the research that has gone into it goes back more like 30 years, pretty much my entire adult life. Those of you who know me might know that from an early age, I became very interested in Hinduism, and I've been part of the Hindu community in North America for, again, pretty much my entire adult life. And so throughout that entire period, I've been exploring, learning, having lots of conversations with people in the community, sort of from the sidelines. In anthropology, they have something called the participant observer method. And I've been following this really just out of my own interest. And but when I was invited to write the book, I realized I had amassed this large body of notes and materials on Hinduism in America. And it was also an opportunity to further explore the history of Hinduism in America. The book is divided into chapters which start with, I have a prologue where I just give a little bit of my own background, an overview of Hinduism for people who aren't familiar with it. And then I start with the 19th century. In fact, the first Hindus who came to America came in the 18th century, and they were mostly sailors on British ships I don't know how many of you know this, but the tea that was dumped in the Boston Harbor, the original Boston Tea Party, that was one of the events that sparked the American Revolution, that tea was from India, and was brought in by the British East India Company. And so I have a chapter on the 19th century reforms that were happening in Hinduism in India at the time, and also people in the Western world who were taking an interest. And then we move into the 20th century. There's a whole chapter just on the 1960s, because that was a period when there was a big explosion of interest in Hinduism. And then you get more Hindus coming to America in the 1970s, right up to the present. So I have a chapter talking about the Hindu communities in America, and then various Hindu influences on American culture: yoga, vegetarianism, religious pluralism, special chapter on Hinduism and popular culture. Hinduism has influenced the Star Wars films, it's influenced the music of the Beatles, it's influenced a lot of things. And then I conclude with a chapter on the more sort of politically engaged Hinduism of recent years, as the community has begun to really sort of find its voice in America. So my presentation today focuses mainly on the chapter where I talk about Hindu influence on Western culture. And I give some historical background to that as well. So I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully you can all now see my PowerPoint with the cover of my book, Hinduism in America. According to the Pew Research Center, which are really one of the top sources for data, sociological data on religion, there are a little more than 2 million Hindus in the US, about 2.25 million Hindus in the US, making up just below 1% of the population. We're talking about 0.7% of the population. So Hindus in America, people who self-identify as Hindu, are a relatively small percentage of the population, again, 0.7%. However, the impact of Hinduism on our culture has been far beyond what that 0.7% might reflect. In fact, there's another group almost as large as the group of people who identify as Hindu, who don't call themselves Hindu religiously, but they've incorporated many elements of Hindu religiosity into their lives. They might participate in a Hindu organization or tradition while also being churchgoers or synagogue goers. So there's a wider penumbra of people actually practicing some form of Hinduism beyond the Hindu community. But even beyond that, Hindu ideas have come to permeate our culture to the point where in 2009, this editorial came out, which created quite a stir at the time. It came out in 2009 by Lisa Miller, a religion writer for Newsweek. It's an article called "We're All Hindus Now." And of course, most Americans don't self-identify as Hindu. So why does Lisa Miller say that? Why that provocative title? Well, she drew her data again from Pew Research, found that 65% of Americans believe, they agree to this statement, that many religions can lead to eternal life, right? That's almost 2 out of 3 people believe that, that you can follow lots of different spiritual paths and you'll still reach the ultimate goal. Well, this is an ancient view in Hinduism. The oldest Hindu scripture, the Rig Veda, has a very famous verse. In Sanskrit, it says, Ekam Sat Bahuda Vipravaranti, which in English means the truth is one, but the wise speak of it in many ways. So this has come to be held as a view by most Americans today, that you can express the truth in a lot of different ways, you can worship God in different ways, they're all going to take you to the ultimate goal. That's not traditionally what Christianity has taught, which is still the largest, by far the largest religion in America, but it's what most Americans believe. This includes 37% of white evangelical Christians. I have a little exclamation point there because you would not necessarily expect that, but a little over 1 out of 3 white evangelical Christians surveyed said, yeah, many religions can lead to eternal life. 24% of Americans, about 1 in 4, believe in reincarnation or rebirth, which is the traditional Hindu belief about what happens to us after we die. 30% of Americans, a lot of them from the younger generation, identify themselves not with any particular religion, but as spiritual, but not religious. And this is actually a very ancient attitude in India as well. In fact, you find this across Asia, India, China, Japan, that it's very common for people to participate in multiple religions. And so rather than be exclusive to one, they have a spirituality that's sort of drawn from the elements that they find most appealing in a variety of traditions. And this is becoming more and more normal in America as well. When I first started teaching at the college, it would be a fairly small handful of sort of rebellious students who would identify themselves as, well, I don't belong to any, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Now, when I ask students, how many of you would identify yourselves this way? It's just about everyone, I find. Very few who don't say this. So it's 30% of Americans overall, but in fact, that number would be higher, I think, if we just polled people under 30. Hinduism has infused popular culture. Lots of celebrities, lots of actors and musicians have been drawn to Hindu paths. This is Julia Roberts. Here she is in a movie role. This is from the film Eat, Pray, Love, which is based on the autobiography of Elizabeth Gilbert, who went on a spiritual journey, as many people do. And during her time in India, she began to practice a Hindu-based spiritual practice called Siddha Yoga. It involves daily meditation, and here's Julia Roberts playing the character. But Julie Roberts in real life is a Hindu. She practices a tradition. This came out after she starred in the movie. She was asked, how can you relate? How well can you relate to that character? And she said, well, very well, actually, because this is what I also practice. So you have Mike Farrell, right? BJ from MASH. He is a devotee of a Hindu teacher called Satya Sai Baba, has been for many, many years. Yes, that's Wolverine there on the right, Hugh Jackman. He is also a practicing Hindu. Now, he's not American, he's Australian, but he spends a lot of his time here in the US. And when the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was first elected back in 2014, there was a big event sponsored for him by Indians in America at Madison Square Garden in New York, and Hugh Jackman was there to introduce Narendra Modi. So Hugh Jackman's also Hindu. This is a still from the film The Life of Pi, tremendously popular film, probably one of my favorite movies of all time, and the book it's based on is also fantastic. It's a very Hindu story. Pi, that's his nickname, but he's a young Indian boy. He grows up Hindu, but he's equally drawn to Christianity and Islam. So he practices all three of them at the same time, and he sees them all as different ways to the same ultimate goal, which again is a traditional Hindu attitude. And if you've seen the film, it's a beautiful story, and in fact, it's really a sort of metaphor about the nature of the self. Pi ends up on a boat alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with a tiger in the boat with him. And this is sort of how we all go through life, right? We all have our outward self, but then we also have that tiger within, right? Sort of your deeper, your spiritual nature, but also your instinctive nature. And how do we navigate that and work our way through life? And The Life of Pi illustrates this nicely. It was a very successful movie when it came out. So how did this all start? Americans have been interested in Hinduism almost as long as America has existed. John Adams, the second president of the United States, we have a letter that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson during the period when they were actually getting along. Those two fought quite a lot, but he refers in one of his letters to this shipment of books that he's received, that he's very excited about because it contains all the latest translations of Indian texts, and he's very excited to immerse himself in that. So there's been strong interest in it among intellectuals, at least from the very beginning. Probably the first really very deeply engaged intellectual with Hinduism in America is pictured here, Ralph Waldo Emerson. My students all say, they read him in high school, but they're not aware that he had such an interest in India. But he did, very profoundly so. Henry David Thoreau, who was Emerson's close friend and associate. Interesting thing about Thoreau, Thoreau talks in Walden about how he's reading the Bhagavad Gita, one of the Hindu scriptures, and how much it inspires him. And it was a work by Thoreau, Civil Disobedience, that actually inspired a young Gandhi to Mohandas K. Gandhi to go back and read the Bhagavad Gita and develop his philosophy of nonviolence. So the influence on Hinduism and America, India and America has gone back and forth. Thoreau was influenced by the Gita, but then Thoreau himself in turn influenced Gandhi. So he sort of returned the compliment, right? Returned the favor. Walt Whitman, another transcendentalist, a great poet, one of his most famous poems, is called The Song of Myself. And if you're not familiar with Hindu philosophy, you might think that it sounds like a selfish poem, right? It sounds like a hymn to, egotism or something. It's not. It's about the infinite self that we are all part of, according to Hindu teaching. He says a very famous stanza from this poem: I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. The idea is that we're all one, that there is one universal self that connects us all. It's an ancient teaching from the Vedas, from the Hindu scriptures. After the Transcendentalists, there came a group called the Theosophical Society, which started in New York in the 1870s. One of their leaders, Annie Besant, went on to actually join the Indian freedom struggle against Britain. She was the leader, briefly, of the Indian National Congress. This isn't well known, but there were Westerners, there were Europeans who supported the Indian independence cause because they had great love for Hinduism and for traditional Indian culture. A.O. Hume on the right was a member of the society. He was a Scotsman, and he was one of the founding members of the Indian National Congress. So the Theosophists were very early, also, again, group of Westerners who felt very drawn to Hinduism and who actually became very actively involved in promoting the Indian cause. The first Hindu spiritual teacher to come to America and have a really big impact was this man, Swami Vivekananda. He had a short life. He lived from 1863 to 1902, so he was only 39 when he passed away. But he had a great love for America, and interestingly, he died on the 4th of July. And there are some who will say that he chose the time of his passing because in the expression used in Hinduism when someone dies is we say he left his body. And they say, he actually suffered from a number of serious illnesses, but he left his body on 4th of July. He spoke at the 1893 Chicago Parliament of World's Religions, and this is really what he's most famous for. This parliament was quite a radical event for its time, but the idea was that the great leaders of all the major traditions would come and give speeches which would show the best of humanity's wisdom traditions. And people in the West didn't know much about Hinduism at the time. And he got up and gave a speech which just really impressed everyone. And he became a very popular speaker. He was very much in demand, and he traveled around the country. He established an organization called the Vedanta Society. Vedanta is Vedic philosophy, Hindu philosophy. The first Vedanta Society, in fact, he's established in 1894, was the Vedanta Society of New York. I've had the privilege of speaking there a few times. And interestingly, it's 1 block away from the Dakota building where John Lennon used to live. So right next to Central Park. The Vedanta Society quickly became a magnet for artists and intellectuals who influenced American popular culture. And the basic thesis of my presentation today is that the reason Hinduism has had such a big impact on American culture, but without many Americans really realizing that Hinduism is the source of a lot of the ideas that they're accepting, is because it's been sort of filtered through people who had a lot of ability to shape culture. So again, artists, actors, I've already mentioned celebrities, actors, thinkers, visionaries, people who are, movers and shakers of culture. And because it influenced those people, its impact reverberated far more than if it was just sort of ordinary folks who were drawn to it. Christopher Isherwood, he was a British expat living in California, quite a well-known author, became very devoted to Vedanta, learned about it from another monk, Swami Prabhavananda, who started the Vedanta Society of Southern California. Another follower of Prabhavananda was Aldous Huxley, another very well-known intellectual, famous for writing a number of books. Brave New World is probably the most famous, a science fiction fiction work. He wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy, where he shows some of the same core ideas and values being taught in all the world's religions, which is one of the teachings in Vedanta, right? The many paths leading to one truth. And he wrote a book about, he actually did some experiments with LSD earlier on in his life, some experiments with consciousness expansion using drugs. And he wrote a book about that experience called The Doors of Perception. And the band, The Doors, called themselves that after that book. They named themselves after Huxley's book. Isherwood and Huxley were both Englishmen who moved to California. J.D. Salinger brings us to the East Coast, the famous author of The Catcher in the Rye. Another book of his, Franny and Zooey, if you read that, it's more or less a primer in the teachings of Hinduism and Buddhism. Buddhism has also been part of this wider American interest in Asian traditions and sources of influence, and the philosophies of the two traditions are very, very close. Interesting note about Salinger, just as his career was really taking off, he suddenly went into seclusion and basically cut off contact from the rest of the world, and everyone thought he'd lost his mind, he'd had a nervous breakdown, something was wrong with Salinger. And only after he died, he gave permission to the Vedanta Society of New York to, after his death, release his correspondence. And it turned out that he was a very deep student of Vedanta, and he removed himself from society so he could spend his time meditating and reading the Bhagavad Gita and corresponding with his guru, his teacher, who was Swami Vivekananda from the New York Center. And so there's an extensive correspondence between Salinger and the Vedanta Society of New York. So this all came out after he passed away. Moving from authors and artists to scholars, Joseph Campbell, renowned scholar of religion and mythology. He was also a good friend of Swami Vivekananda at the New York Center. He helped him translate the Gospel of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna is a Hindu sage of the 19th century who was the teacher of Vivekananda, who sort of sent all of these Hindu monks to America to spread these teachings. And Campbell was very involved in that. And of course, Joseph Campbell influenced George Lucas. George Lucas read one of Campbell's works, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, about the hero's mythic journey, and it gave him the idea for Star Wars. And Star Wars is full of Hindu terms and concepts. Even the name Yoda means warrior, actually, in Sanskrit. And if any of my former Sanskrit students are here watching today, yeah, remember Yoda. That is, Yoda means warrior. And so lots and lots of concepts, the force especially, the idea of a universal energy that's in all things, that connects all of us. That is that self that Whitman is talking about, right? The universal self, the Atman and the Paramatman, the supreme self. It's all there in Star Wars. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, has also been a big influence, especially in terms of movements of protest against injustice of various kinds. The idea that you can protest non-violently. And I think this is very relevant to things that are going on still today in America, right? That one needs to stand against injustice, but one also needs to not participate in it oneself, right? And to do the very things that are being done to you. Gandhi used nonviolent means to protest against the British, and there's debate about whether that was the decisive thing that got the British to leave India, but it was certainly a factor. Gandhi influenced Martin Luther King in the 60s. In fact, via Reverend James Lawson, it was Reverend Lawson who actually first studied Gandhi and brought the ideas of nonviolence to the African-American civil rights movement. Reverend Lawson's still with us today, and he spoke at the funeral of John Lewis very movingly recently. And he mentioned Gandhi, and he mentioned the term satyagraha, holding fast to truth, and ahimsa, nonviolence, which are the sort of two pillars of Gandhi's philosophy. So this has had a big influence in America. Gandhi inspired and influenced Martin Luther King, the nonviolent struggle for equal rights for African Americans, and similar movements around the world. Coming to popular music, George Harrison, my favorite Beatle, influenced me a lot. I was just listening to him this morning, and there he is at his home. because the Beatles were just so tremendously influential on culture. I'd say George Harrison has been one of the people who's had the most impact in terms of spreading and popularizing Hindu ideas. This was really big in the 60s. Here's a cover of Jimi Hendrix's second album, Axis Bold as Love. This is an image taken from the Bhagavad Gita. There's a scene in the Gita where the character Krishna, who is God in human form, he's explaining Vedanta philosophies to his friend, the warrior Arjuna. And at one point, Arjuna asks him, he says, reveal your true form to me. And so Krishna appears to him as all the different gods and goddesses. He says, I'm the divine that is within all beings. Somewhat controversially, Jimi Hendrix put himself in the place of Krishna here, and his two band members. They're sort of like a little Trimurti. You know, the actual Trimurti you can see on the batik behind me that I bought in India many, many years ago. But this imagery, this sort of the way the traditional Hindu imagery sort of blends in with kind of the psychedelic sensibility of the 60s. And it was a big part of the aesthetic of that whole period. And of course, people were getting very seriously into meditation at that time. The Beatles learned transcendental meditation from Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. George Harrison later got involved with ISKCON, the Hare Krishna movement. These are all Hindu teachers that came to the Western world to spread these ancient ideas. Hinduism has also spread in America due to increasing numbers of Indian Hindu immigrants to the United States. This was made possible by the lifting in 1965 of the deeply racist Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. I have a considerable section in my book where I talk about how in the early 20th century, there were Hindus coming into America, Sikhs and Muslims and as well, members of various traditions practiced in India. And the spiritual teachers like Swami Vivekananda, Paramahansa Yogananda, many, many others, they all got big followings and people were very fond of what they were teaching. But ordinary Indians who came in faced a lot of prejudice. There were actually riots in Bellingham, Washington, in the state of Washington. A number of Sikhs who had been in the British military, when they finished their military service, they came to the West Coast and joined the logging industry. And their plan was to earn some money and then go back home and get married and settle down back in India. But they faced a big backlash. And there was an organization called the Asiatic Exclusion League, and they wanted Indians, who they called Hindus, even if they weren't Hindu, right? There were Sikhs, there were Muslims. They called them all Hindus. They wanted Hindus, Chinese, and Japanese all kicked out, right? Excluded. And a law was passed in 1924 called the Asian Exclusion Act. One of the tragic consequences of this, there was a Hindu teacher. He was actually teaching. His teaching was interesting. He was conveying the idea that the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Hinduism were essentially one and the same. And he was the first Indian to get American citizenship, and he was the first Indian to have his citizenship stripped away when this act was passed. So Indians were excluded until 65 when, because of the civil rights movement, because of Martin Luther King, when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, this led to sort of a rewriting of a number of laws because it was discovered that there were a lot of laws that were contrary to what the Civil Rights Act had established. So they were overturned. So the Asian Exclusion Act was overturned in 65. So then you have ordinary people. You have Hindus coming to America, settling. The photo of the Hindu temple that you see here is in Pittsburgh. This is the Venkateshwara temple. It's a South Indian style temple in Pittsburgh. One of many Hindu temples in Pittsburgh, actually. Pittsburgh has a very thriving Hindu community. In recent years, since the 21st century has begun, the Hindu American Foundation and other organizations have been established. Hindu Americans have begun to speak up for their rights and the rights of others and to correct popular misconceptions about Hinduism. There's a lot about Hinduism that is misunderstood. Textbooks that are used in the middle school and high school level often contain a lot of stereotypes. There's a very heavy emphasis on the traditional Indian social system. I say Indian social system because it's not exclusive to Hindus. It's widely known as caste or the caste system. And the caste system is a real thing, but it is certainly not the all-encompassing reality of Hinduism. And in fact, there are many Hindus who don't believe in or abide by caste or traditional caste rules. I can give the example of my own father-in-law, who's a Brahmin, which if you follow a strict interpretation of caste, would mean he should have become a Hindu priest. He was a doctor and a pilot, so not traditional roles for a Brahmin. So a lot of misconceptions. There's no social mobility in Hinduism. Hindus are poor because Hindus are fatalistic. There's poverty in India because the British removed roughly $27 trillion worth of wealth in terms of today's money from India during the time they ruled it. So a lot of these things are not well presented. So Hindu American Foundation, one of their many activities has been working with the various school systems across the country and with the textbook manufacturers to get more accurate textbooks out there. As Caitlin mentioned at the beginning, this particular organization, I'm very grateful to say, gave me an award a couple of years ago for actually I have to say very humble, very little bit of work that I've done in this regard. But the Hindu community is very gracious and very grateful and appreciates this kind of help and support. Hindus in America just want to be treated with respect like any other tradition, any other group. According to Hinduism, because of the belief that many paths lead to God, many paths lead to salvation, there's no proselytizing. There's no attempt to convert people to Hinduism. So Hindus aren't in America to try to get other people to be Hindu. They're happy to share their ideas. When Swami Vivekananda came, he just wanted people to learn about the philosophy. If they wanted to follow it, fine. If not, that's also fine, right? Your path is your path. But Hindus in America want to receive the same respect that other traditions have. And in the book, what I've traced is that the Hindu American community is about 90% an immigrant community, right? Immigrants or descendants of just one or two generations back of immigrants mostly from India. About 10% of Hindus in America are people like myself who've adopted and taken up the tradition. But the Hindu American experience is very similar to the immigrant experiences of a lot of other communities. You see a lot of the same kinds of struggles and triumphs in the story of Hinduism in America. This past year, we had our first Hindu presidential candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, Democratic representative from Hawaii. She didn't get very far. I think the highest I saw her in the national polls was maybe 2%. But just the fact that she is someone who practices Hinduism, she's not herself of Indian descent. Her parents joined a Hindu tradition, and she grew up in it in Hawaii. But just the fact that there was a Hindu presidential candidate was very exciting to a lot of Hindus. And at the same event where the Hindu American Foundation gave me the Dharma Seva Award, I actually got to meet Tulsi Gabbard. And there she is, standing between my wife and myself. If the alumni are watching this, any of you who studied Japanese, you'll recognize Dr. Bhattacharya. That's my wife. We've both been teaching here at the college for the last 20 years. And yeah, we sat at our table. We were sort of directed to a table, said, okay, sit here. And then about midway through our dinner, Tulsi Gabbard came and sat with us. And we were quite excited to see, this congresswoman coming, and she hadn't yet declared that she was going to run for president, but we got to meet her. So that's the first time it wasn't the first time we had met, but that's the only presidential candidate I've ever met in my life. So there you go. The story of the Hindu community and the spread of Hindu ideals in America is a story of ongoing evolution, engagement, and empowerment. These three E's were themes of President Cecilia McCormick's inaugural year, right? Her first year as president of Elizabethtown College. And I was very privileged, very pleased to give a version of this presentation at a symposium that was held in honor of her inauguration. So we were asked to mention these three themes at that presentation. And they're very appropriate for this topic. As American society continues to evolve, by engaging with Hindu ideals and the Hindu community itself, is empowered to add its unique thread to the tapestry of American life. So it's happening all around, right? Evolution is there all around because we're all developing, we're all changing and learning from one another, engaging with one another. And this is empowering, right? Our society is stronger when we learn from one another and draw from the strengths of every community and every tradition, the best of all the different possible worlds. And so I called my book A Convergence of Worlds, because you have the world of America and its values and its traditions coming together with the world of Hinduism, drawn mostly from India, and these two converging and coming together. Not always easily. Again, there have been bumps in the road. There still continue to be issues of racism, for example, and exclusion. At the same time, there's been a lot of mutual influence of American society on Hindus, especially Hindus in America, but even Hindus in India often look to America as a country that plays a leadership role in the world. And yet, at the same time, the reverse is also true, that there have been many Americans through history, going all the way back to John Adams and right up coming into, the 1960s and even up to now, Americans who've looked to Hinduism as a source of inspiration and wisdom. And so this process continues to the present day. So I will, that's the end of my formal presentation. As Caitlin said, if any of you have any questions, if you'd like to continue this conversation with me, my email is longjd, LONGJD. The D is important, otherwise it goes to other people. I've had that experience before. longjd at etown.edu. And I promise to reply to you as soon as I can. And I just wish you all well. And as I've been speaking, again, knowing this is an alumni presentation, I've just been thinking about all the students I've taught in the time I've been here. And I'm hoping you tune in and get to see this program.
Yeah, Dr. Long, thank you so much again. I learned so much. I think one of the biggest tidbits I pulled out of that was the influence of Hinduism on popular culture, like the Beatles. And I have to tell you too, I learned about Ralph Waldo Emerson and the other individual you spoke. Thoreau, yes. I never realized the influence of Hinduism they had on a lot of their teachings and things. So that's just fascinating to me. And like I said, I can't thank you enough and for doing this for us and being here with us today. And like Dr. Long said, if you want to continue the conversation with him, please do so. Long JD, and the D is important, at etown.edu. Thank you so much again, Dr. Long, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone.